Intro. Today we will be doing a bit of a dive into the life of Daniel DC Cormier. Also known as DC, DC is a UFC Hall of Famer, a former double champion, current UFC commentator, business owner, father, and husband. Background and intro to wrestling. Let's begin at the start. Born in 1979 in Lafayette, Louisiana. When DC was only 7, his father was killed by the father of his wife. When DC was 11, the local school wrestling coach saw him wrestling with his brothers. It was at this point that the coach approached the boys and told DC that he should consider wrestling for the school. DC, being a big fan of wrestling, agreed. Naive, young DC turned up for his first day expecting to learn some WWE moves. However, little did he know this was the first day of the rest of his life. The sport of wrestling would ultimately allow DC the determination and grit to go from his small hometown in Lafayette, Louisiana, to the Olympic Games and around the world as UFC champion. DC had a lot of success in his wrestling career in high school, accumulating an impressive 101 wins to 9 losses. On the international platform, DC's wrestling record included 6-time U.S. World or Olympic team member, a World Bronze medalist, a World Cup runner-up, a Pan American Games gold medalist, bronze in 2007, and a 2-time Pan American champion. It is during this time is when DC is hit by the single biggest tragedy since the passing of his father. When DC's 3-month-old daughter, Caden Imrie Cormier, tragically died in a car crash on June 14, 2003. A third tragedy struck when DC's own body began to shut down as a consequence of pushing his body too far during the weight cut for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which ultimately led to DC being pulled from the prestigious competition. Pre-UFC MMA career. DC's mixed martial arts career began at the age of 30 when DC signed to the fighting promotion Strikeforce. DC was training MMA at AKA, American Kickboxing Academy, where he befriended and was tutored by Javier Mendez. It was at AKA that DC would go on to establish lifelong friendships with the likes of Javier Mendez, Josh Koscheck, Luke Rockhold, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Islam Makhachev, and last but perhaps most infamously, his friendship with Cain Velasquez, who was DC's heavyweight sparring partner and considered the greatest heavyweight during his time in the octagon. DC had his pro debut on September 25, 2009 against Gary Frazier, which he won. DC's first big notable win in MMA came under the promotion XMMA 2 ANZ vs USA in Australia, where he fought against Lucas Brown. Just over a month later, DC went on to win a title from Kyoto HC, where he fought Tony Johnston. DC's next big opportunity came in the form of Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. Despite being initially worried that he wasn't experienced enough for the Strikeforce Grand Prix, he went on to fight Antonio Bigfoot Silva and eventually captured the Strikeforce title from Josh Barnett on May 19, 2012. DC would fight under the Strikeforce banner one more time before entering the UFC roster. UFC debut and career. DC made his UFC debut on April 20, 2013, on the Henderson vs. Melendez card, where he won by decision against Frank Mir. During DC's second fight against Roy Nelson, he announced he would be moving down to light heavyweight. DC disclosed that the reason behind this was due to Cain Velasquez being the current UFC heavyweight champion, and DC stating that they wouldn't fight each other for money as their bond was too strong. It was at this point in DC's career that he started to draw some flack, with the ghost of the 2008 Olympics coming back to haunt him. His critics claimed that DC would not be able to consistently cut the weight needed in order to drop down to light heavyweight and to be able to fight effectively with his weight loss. DC was initially supposed to make his light heavyweight debut at UFC 170, fighting against Rashard Evans. However, Rashard pulled out of the fight due to a leg injury just 10 days out from the fight. Patrick Cummins, who DC had come across him previously in his career, stepped up to take the fight. DC won the fight via TKO from punches in the first round, thereby cementing his claim in the light heavyweight division and silencing a lot of his critics. DC's next fight came against Dan Henderson, where DC demonstrated his wrestling prowess and controlled Henderson and eventually submitted him in the third round. This earned him a fight with the man who would go on to potentially be DC's biggest rival, Jon Jones. In the lead up to the much anticipated fight, the two rivals had a brawl at a UFC media event. The fight was a tough fight for both rivals, with Jon Jones gaining the win after 5 rounds by unanimous decision. After the fight, Jon Jones' life outside the octagon caught up with him in the form of a hit-and-run accident and testing positive for cocaine, which in turn violated the UFC code of conduct and led to Jones being stripped of the title. This left the belt vacant, and DC was back in the running for the title. The UFC set up a fight for Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnston for the vacant light heavyweight title on the UFC 182 card. This card is where DC would get his first taste of UFC gold around his waist when he submitted Johnston in the third round. DC went on to defend his newly earned title against Alexander Gustafsson, Anderson Silva, and Anthony Johnston again before Jon Jones ultimately returned from suspension and was allowed an immediate rematch for the light heavyweight title. Jones caught DC with a head kick and ground and pound, resulting in the fight being declared a TKO and awarding Jones the victory. This left a bitter taste in DC's mouth. However, DC was soon to catch another break as Jones again broke UFC code of conduct by testing positive for steroids. Jones would be stripped of the title, and DC was reasserted as light heavyweight champion once more. DC went on to fight Volkan Ozdemir, which he won via TKO. However, to DC, the win was overshadowed by the feeling that it was more of an interim title rather than the actual title, and until he defeated Jon Jones, it wouldn't be official. Unfortunately, this fight never materialized with DC retiring, and Jon Jones taking several years off and moving up to heavyweight. This victory would set DC up for another big rivalry between himself and the man many people considered the heavyweight GOAT at the time, Stipe Miocic. This rivalry was amplified when both were put on the UFC Ultimate Fighter, undefeated Series 27 as coaches to opposing teams. The show ended up being a draw with Stipe's lightweight fighters winning and DC's featherweight fighters winning also. Although they were rivals, both Stipe and DC displayed mutual respect during the build-up to the fight. The fight, UFC 226, would be over quickly though as DC caught Stipe in the first round and knocked him out from punches in the clinch. This dramatic finish put DC as the current light heavyweight champion and the new heavyweight champion for the UFC, giving him that highly coveted double champ status. DC went on to defend his heavyweight title against Derek, Black Beast, Lewis beating him by submission in the second round. After the Lewis fight, DC had surgery on his back, and that should potentially have been his career finished there. However, whether for the money or the glory, DC chose to fight again. DC was given the all-clear medically and decided to defend his heavyweight title against none other than Stipe Miocic. DC lost the fight, and as a result the title. Granted a rematch, DC fought Stipe again and lost. DC retired at UFC 252. Post-retirement and commentating. On August 16, 2020, DC would further cement his place in the history UFC by taking the position of UFC commentator. DC has earned the adoration and respect of fans and fighters world over, besides Dom, which has allowed him to excel at his current role as commentator. As well as commentating for the UFC, DC also is the head wrestling coach at Gilroy High School, California, and has been since summer of 2018. On April 21st of 2021, Daniel Cormier was inducted into the ALHSAA Hall of Fame due to his sporting accomplishments. And again, his sporting accomplishments were acknowledged on June 30th, 2022. All of DC's achievements inside the UFC accumulated in him being inducted into the UFC's Hall of Fame. Outro. The life of Daniel Cormier is one that has been full of trauma and hardship. However, ultimately, it was these hardships that allowed DC to fuel his desires and to propel himself, his family, and those around him to places he could only dream of as a little boy in Lafayette, Louisiana. If we can take away anything from the story of DC's life and career, the lesson should be this. If life knocks you down, and you're able to channel that feeling and turn it into positive, the world will be your oyster.